Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 302, Queens, North and South. In the early months of 1565, Cecil had every reason to think that Elizabeth might finally marry. She was reconsidering the Archduke, plus word reached court that, desperate to avoid a Habsburg alliance, Catherine de' Medici was offering Charles IX to the English Queen. Elizabeth was not interested in marrying a 14-year-old boy, however. She was 31 and publicly worried about what people might say. Besides, Charles did not speak a word of English, and he was Catholic. Those both appeared to be deal breakers. But mindful of keeping France and Scotland separate, Elizabeth gave her usual half-promises in the hope of stringing Charles along. Most of Elizabeth's Privy Council advised her against the match anyway. It would be easier and better, they argued, for her to wed a Habsburg. Cecil said nothing. He didn't think that Elizabeth was serious. As usual, he was right. For the next 5 months, Elizabeth played her usual game and played it well. Charles thought he was set to marry the English queen, though in reality, nothing of the sort had ever been agreed to. But of course, Elizabeth was not the only single queen in the British Isles. To the north, Mary Stuart was also still without a husband. By February 1565, Thomas Randolph had been working for 18 months to bring Mary and Robert Dudley together. It seemed like Mary was finally warming to the idea. Randolph was, therefore, disappointed when he found out that Elizabeth was finally going to allow another suitor, Lord Darnley, to go to Scotland in an effort to woo the Queen. When Darnley arrived in Edinburgh on February the 13th, Mary extended to him a warm welcome, and her feelings for him were obvious from the very beginning. Within a few days, people were saying she could scarcely stand to be apart from him. Quickly, Mary became set on the idea of marriage, though her counselors urged her delay and patience. True, Darnley could be well-mannered, and he was handsome. But he was also, and she didn't know this, petulant and unstable. Mary wrote to Elizabeth hoping to get her claim to the English throne recognized before marrying Darnley. She would be disappointed again. Elizabeth wrote back that no, she should marry Dudley, not Darnley. Sorry about the similarity of these names. And worse still, Elizabeth was not going to say anything publicly about Mary's claim to the English throne. But by now, Mary was far too much in love with Darnley to care. When he fell ill with measles, Mary acted as his nurse, regardless of the potential consequences. Mary's advisors, concerned about Darnley's Catholicism, continued trying, without avail, to pump the brakes. All the while back in England, Dudley continued to focus on marrying another queen, Elizabeth. In fact, the Spanish ambassador was so shocked at the way the two interacted that he wrote back to Philip he believed Dudley was on the very cusp of marrying the English queen. On the 18th of April, the Scottish ambassador informed Elizabeth that Mary was going to wed Lord Darnley. It was a done deal. Elizabeth was furious. She sent word to Scotland demanding Darnley come back immediately and forbade the marriage. Now it was all emotion. Mary shot back that, quote, she did not mind to use her own choice in marriage. She would no longer be fed with yea and nay, end quote. Elizabeth did at least realize at this point that Mary was not going to wed Dudley. And for this part, Dudley took this as a sign that his marriage to Elizabeth was imminent. Not everyone liked or loved this notion, and so it was by the summer of 1565, rival factions began forming really for the first time in Elizabeth's court. On one side, of course, was Dudley. On the other side was what we might call today the opposition. The leader of the opposition was the Earl of Sussex, who used Dudley's great rival, the Duke of Norfolk, to offset the power of the Queen's favorite. By July, men of both sides were openly carrying arms in London. Matters by then were coming to a head. By the end of June, Elizabeth formally rejected the young French king's suit, saying that she would not marry someone so much her junior. Cecil, Sussex, and others realized that this was likely Dudley's best chance to move and seal the deal once and for all. Hence, the anti-Dudley camp worked furiously to bring about the Habsburg match. When the imperial ambassador arrived in the English court around the same time, Cecil pressed Dudley to support the Archduke Charles's marital suit, if for no other reason, out of loyalty to the realm. Elizabeth, for the moment, seemed receptive to the idea of marrying the Archduke, so Dudley, feeling very much sort of pressed in, acquiesced and supported the match, at least publicly. Then, in a case of conflict making strange bedfellows, the French turned around and decided they were going to support a marriage with Robert Dudley to the Queen. They just didn't want to see themselves surrounded by Habsburgs on both sides of the English Channel. As usual, no one could tell what the Queen really thought about any of this. At the end of July, Elizabeth declared, quote, "I would have stayed single, did not the crown of England compel me to marry to the prophet of England," end quote. Be that as it may, the imperial ambassador was at least convinced that the rumors about the Queen's honor and Dudley's amorous intentions were simply unfounded. So she could take some solace in that. But once again, when we're talking about a Habsburg match, the marriage negotiations broke down over the issue of religion. Both sides continued to insist that the other convert. Sussex suggested that the Archduke might attend Anglican services with Elizabeth in public and then Catholic Mass in private, which the Emperor rejected as an insult. Once more, the two sides seemed deadlocked, though both were still hopeful of achieving some sort of compromise. On July 29, 1565, Mary Stuart married Lord Darnley, who clearly did not return to England, by the way, though he was ordered to do so. Within mere weeks, Darnley had alienated just about every Scottish noble at court. The majority of Scots distrusted him because he was a Catholic anyway. Suddenly, the prospect of civil war in Scotland appeared increasingly likely. To the south, when Elizabeth found out about the marriage, she was incensed, as you probably expected. Even efforts to reach out to Queen Mary were rebuffed. Mary Stuart had, by July 1565, made a fateful decision. She was going to rule Scotland the way she wanted, and no one was going to tell her any differently. That meant she was going to control the Scottish lords and force, eventually, Catholicism down her subjects' throats. How would that go? Spoiler alert, as we'll find out in a second, not well, as you might guess. July 1565 was also the beginning of a change in relations between Mary and Elizabeth. Remember, they had been on the cusp of a personal meeting, but now the two became increasingly antagonistic. That August, another dynastic issue surfaced. Her sister in disgrace, Lady Mary Grey, was now technically the closest in line to inherit the throne. Now Mary, as opposed to her sister, was not beautiful. She was hunchbacked and had no interest in ever being queen. That being said, Elizabeth kept this remaining Grey sister at court under her watchful eye. Now, be that as it may, and with all these precautions, somehow Grey got herself secretly married, which was fast becoming sort of a rite of passage for the Grey family, or at least the Grey sisters, until Elizabeth found out about this and then flew off the handle. Now, I want to be clear about one thing. Mary Grey was never an actual threat to Elizabeth's legitimacy. But the simple fact that Elizabeth responded to this incident with such rage is really just an indication of how sensitive she had become about the topic of succession. Elizabeth clearly understood how precarious her situation was. After yet another Grey affair, it became all the more imperative for the Queen to marry. At least that was the perspective of Cecil and others. However, the international tide was starting to turn. Critically, Philip of Spain was no longer in support of Elizabeth marrying the Archduke of Austria. Philip no longer believed that the marital bed was the way to make England Catholic again. He now believed that the best path forward ran through Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, at this point, Philip was not, I repeat, not planning a coup. He believed that Elizabeth, at some point, would probably die of natural causes, and without a better option, the English lords, maybe with a little bit of Spanish support, would be compelled to accept Mary as queen. This would give Philip the pliant female ruler he wanted in charge of England, without all the hassle of either finding Elizabeth a suitable husband or just replacing her by force. His belief was reinforced by rumors, which were true, that Dudley was no longer Elizabeth's sole favorite. Dudley would remain at court for the rest of his life. Some might argue that he was Elizabeth's one and only true love until the end. But the fact of the matter was that Elizabeth was now spreading her favor more widely, and Dudley knew it. He now knew he would never be King of England, and soon everyone else would too. To the north, things weren't much better for Mary Stuart. Several of her lords were now in open rebellion, and she managed to chase them south until they reached England, where they sought protection in the court of Elizabeth. But if there was one thing that Elizabeth was especially prickly about, it was disobedience by male lords against a female sovereign. Even if civil war in Scotland was in her best interest, which it was not in this case, Elizabeth would not lift a finger to ail male subjects attempting to overthrow Mary, their female sovereign. More likely than not, she just didn't like the precedent that particular decision would have set. But though Elizabeth would not support rebellion in the north, that did not mean that things were peaceful. Scotland remained a tinderbox. Darnley seemingly did his best every day to alienate everyone he could, including his own wife. Mary now detested her husband and saw him as little as possible. Darnley was fine with this arrangement and went hunting as much as he could, while Mary attended to matters of state. Making matters worse, Mary had now developed a liking for one of her secretaries, an Italian gentleman who had come with her from France. Darnley openly suspected them of having an affair. When Mary became pregnant that December, there were more than a few whispers about whose child it was. Things weren't much better in London. The rivalry between Dudley and Norfolk had now reached Capulet and Montague levels. Seriously, each side now wore their own livery, purple for Dudley, yellow for Norfolk, and settled their disputes in the streets with physical violence. Elizabeth mediated all these conflicts as best she could, but do little to avoid the obvious favoritism she continued to show Dudley. That Christmas, he again asked the Queen to marry him. As usual, she deferred, saying he would need to wait for February for an answer. All the while, the obvious animosity between Dudley and Norfolk continued to simmer. They pretended to be friends at court, but everyone knew this was just a show, and that one major provocation might cause the entire situation to explode. Yet, the country got a short reprieve weeks later, when both Dudley and Norfolk left court. Dudley left mostly out of frustration. He was tired of everyone blaming him for the country's failures and giving Elizabeth credit for all the successes. Critically, he was angry that everyone blamed him for the fact that she remained unmarried. He had, in fact, urged her many times to marry for the sake of England, and she had not. There was nothing he could do about it. Now, back in Scotland, things had gone from bad to worse. Darnley was now convinced that his wife was having an affair and wanted her Italian secretary gone. Thus, he began a conspiracy with the Scottish lords in which he was actually just a tool. The plan, as far as Darnley knew, was to murder the Italian in front of Mary. It was believed the shock might incapacitate her, or perhaps even cause her death. Regardless, he agreed with the conspirators that she would be shut up after the deed was done, and that he would rule Scotland. At least, that was what the conspirators told Darnley the plan was. In reality, they intended to double-cross him. They would kill the Italian, sure, but then they would blame it all on Darnley, and insist that he immediately be executed for treason, thus removing two potential impediments to their power. Cecil, in England, knew about the plot, but did nothing. Elizabeth didn't know about it until it was all over. On March the 9th, 1566, while the Queen was dining with her Italian secretary and another woman, Darnley and two other men burst into the room, dragged the man away, and savagely murdered him. Mary was in a state of shock. But over the next 2 days, she managed to convince her not-so-intelligent husband that he was clearly the next target. At midnight on March the 11th, the royal couple fled to a nearby royal castle at Dunbar. Note, Mary was 6 months pregnant this whole time, so it was quite the feat. On March 18th, the couple returned to Edinburgh with an army of 8,000 men. But by then, the conspirators had already fled. Mary's brief reconciliation with her husband, however, proved short-lived when she discovered just how involved in the murder plot he had been. Now everyone at court treated him with barely concealed contempt, and he sulked around like a petulant child. But to the south, Elizabeth was appalled with what Mary had gone through, and the two women seemed to grow briefly closer as a result. Mary even wrote to Elizabeth, urging her to marry the Archduke, in her opinion, an excellent match. Not that she was a good judge of those sorts of things. On June 19th, Mary Stuart gave birth to a healthy son, James. Not only did that immeasurably increase her own legitimacy, but it also strengthened her claim to the English throne. In England, Elizabeth appeared to react to the news positively, spurring rumors that she would, shortly, announce Mary as her heir apparent. This was the case particularly because now that Mary had a healthy son, the path of succession would be clear in that direction. Cecil heard persistent rumors that Mary was entering into negotiations with Catholic nobles in the north of England, hoping one day to forcibly take over the English government if he had to, but he thought very little of those rumors. And he was right to discount them. Mary had her hands full trying to establish a stable government in Scotland. Plus, relations between herself and Darnley were now positively frigid. Darnley had begun threatening that he might choose to live abroad someday, a fact that was intensely embarrassing to Mary. In August, the imperial ambassador returned to Vienna frustrated. It seemed that the negotiations for a marriage between Elizabeth and the Archduke had reached yet another impasse. Though, to be fair, Elizabeth wrote directly to the emperor, making it clear that this had nothing at all to do with Dudley. Shortly thereafter, she dispatched Sussex to Vienna with the express intent of completing these negotiations. However, the orders that Sussex took with him seemed more likely to produce further delays, which was almost certainly the point. That fall, desperately short of money, Elizabeth had no choice but to call a session of Parliament. Once more, the Commons was determined to have the succession crisis ended. Elizabeth ordered Cecil to tell the Commons that she was going to marry, but she wouldn't say to whom or when. This time, though, the House of Lords and the House of Commons were defiant. They declared they would not grant any subsidy at all until the succession issue had been decided. Elizabeth was furious, and she struck her usual refrain that her marriage was not Parliament's business. On October the 21st, a delegation from the House of Lords met with the Queen and begged her to name a successor. Elizabeth refused and reminded them that if she were a man, no one would make these demands of her. The Lords could do as they pleased, and so would she. Matters got progressively worse the next day when the Lords and Commons held a joint session and declared they would not decide any government business at all until the succession issue was decided. Matters could not rest as they were, and Elizabeth knew it. She therefore summoned a delegation of 30 members from each House of Parliament to Whitehall, but refused to allow the Speaker to accompany them, since she alone meant to do all the talking this time. Barely containing her anger, she opened by accusing, quote, unbridled person in the Commons of plotting a traitorous trick, end quote. Then rehearsed all the old arguments against naming her successor, administering a stinging rebuke to the Lords for rashly supporting the Commons in all this nonsense. She said, quoting now, was I not born in this realm? Were not my parents? Is not my kingdom here? Whom have I oppressed? Whom have I enriched to the other's harm? How have I governed since my reign? I will be tried by envy itself. I need not use many words, for my deeds do try me. I have sent word that I will marry, and I will never break the word of a prince said in a public place for my honor's sake. And therefore, I say again, I will marry as soon as I can conveniently, and I hope to have children. Otherwise, I would never marry. She went on further to talk about the succession as follows. None of you have been a second person in the realm as I have, or tasted the practices against my sister, whom I would to God were alive again. There are some now in the Commons who, in my sister's reign, had tried to involve me in their conspiracies. Were it not for my honor, their knavery would be known. I would never place my successor in that petition, end quote. The succession question was a difficult one, and she acknowledged that to Parliament. But firmly, she chided them for their impertinence, because it was for her, the sovereign, to decide the succession, and not for them. All she would say, ultimately, was that she would resolve the succession problem when she could do so without imperiling herself. As for her mutinous subjects, she hoped the instigators of all this trouble would repent and openly confess their fault. Quote, as for my own part, I care not for death, for all men are mortal, and though I be a woman, yet I have as good a courage answerable to my place as ever my father had. I am your anointed queen. I will never be by violence constrained to do anything. I thank God I am endowed with such qualities that if I were turned out of the realm in my petticoat, I were able to live in any place in Christendom, end quote. The Lords actually seemed somewhat subdued by this response. But the Commons, well, that was another matter. When Cecil read out his edited draft of the Queen's speech to the House, it was received in stony silence. And 3 days later, there were more calls for a petition. Elizabeth had now had quite enough of this insubordination. On her orders, on November the 9th, Parliament was informed that they needed to be satisfied with her promise to marry, because that was all they were going to get. This prompted another uproar. So on November the 11th, she summoned the Speaker of the House of Commons before her and told him herself that she was done with this conversation and the House needed to move on to the business of government. The Commons, however, refused to be silent. They had her in a corner, and they knew it. She badly needed the money, and Parliament was the only way she was going to get it. She had two choices: dissolve Parliament and not get the money she needed, or give in. The original dispute over the succession was turning into a battle over the privileges of the monarch and the privileges of Parliament. Elizabeth had no wish for a showdown over this sensitive issue. Wisely, in the end, Elizabeth capitulated, conceding that the members might have a free discussion on the succession question and remitting 1/3 of the subsidy she had asked for. The Commons were so overjoyed and gratified at this that they agreed to proceed at once to the money bill without debating the succession. So she got everything she wanted. But when Parliament tried to incorporate the Queen's promise to Mary into the preamble to the bill, she took one outraged look at the draft presented for her approval and scrawled in the margin, quote, "I know no reason why my private answers to the realm should serve for prologue on subsidy book. Neither do I understand why such audacity should be used to make without my license an act of my words," end quote. The preamble was then discreetly removed, leaving in the draft just a brief reference to Parliament's pious wish that the succession question would be resolved in the future. This, of course, dashed the hopes of Mary Stuart, who had expected her claim to be ratified by Parliament. On January the 2nd, 1567, Elizabeth dissolved Parliament, sourly advising its members, quote, "Beware, however, you prove your prince's patience, as you have now done mine. Let my discipline stand instead of storer stokes, and let my comfort pluck up your dismayed spirits. A more loving prince towards you, ye shall never have," unquote. She behaved as though she had won this war, but Cecil pointed out that she had actually been, more than anything else, the loser in the contest, passing her a memorandum in which he enumerated what had not been achieved. Quote, "The succession not answered, the marriage not followed, dangers ensuing, general disorientations." To the north, on December 17th, 1566, the future King James was christened in Catholic fashion. It would be the last time a Scottish monarch was christened in the Catholic manner. Darnley refused to attend his son's baptism. Elizabeth was named the boy's godmother and represented at the ceremony by the Earl of Bedford. After christening, Bedford informed Mary that he had good news. Elizabeth had agreed she would block any legislation prejudicial to Mary's claim to the English throne if Mary agreed not to press the issue while Elizabeth lived. During the winter, Darnley fell dangerously ill, most likely as a result of contracting syphilis. On January the 20th, Mary visited Darnley where he was staying in Glasgow and convinced him to return to Edinburgh. He agreed. His first night back, Mary sat up with him and gave every appearance all was well. On the night of February the 8th, Mary announced that she was finally ready to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, and the next day her envoy left for England with the good news. Mary had intended to spend that night with Darnley where he was in residency, but then remembered she had promised to attend a wedding nearby, so she kissed her husband goodbye and left for the palace. On the night of February the 10th, 1567, a violent explosion shook Edinburgh. The source of the explosion? The house in which Darnley had been staying. His corpse was discovered shortly thereafter. Now, to be clear, the explosion had not killed him. He had been strangled. The explosion was evidently intended to cover up evidence of the murder. When news reached Mary, she was reportedly horrified. She said she would have been killed as well had she not left to attend the wedding. However, everyone knew the Queen had a motive for killing her husband, whom she had long regarded as a dangerous liability. People might also suspect the Scottish lords of wanting Darnley dead, chief among them Lord Bothwell, who many believed wanted to marry the Queen and thereby gain the crown for himself. This was confirmed when on April the 24th, Bothwell effectively kidnapped Mary as she was making her way back to Edinburgh and reportedly, quote-unquote, ravished her so that she would have no choice but to marry him. Many believed, however, that the Queen had been in on the whole thing and was in cahoots with the Lord to murder her husband and marry him. Regardless, the two, Mary and Lord Bothwell, were wed on May 15th in a Protestant ceremony. Elizabeth was appalled with her cousin's conduct and wrote to her as follows, quote, "To be plain with you, Mary, our grief has not been small thereat. For how could a worse choice be made for your honor than in such haste to marry a subject who, besides other notorious lacks, public fame has charged with the murder of your late husband, besides touching yourself in some part, though we trust in that behalf falsely. And with what peril have you married him, that hath another lawful wife, nor any children betwixt you legitimate? Thus you see our opinion plainly, and we are heartily sorry we can conceive no better. We are earnestly bent to do everything in our power to procure the punishment of that murderer against any subject you have, how dear soever you should hold him, and next thereto to be careful how your son, the prince, may be preserved to the comfort of you and your realm." End quote. But the Scottish lords had no interest in this new rival for power either. They had already done away with Darnley and had no interest in a new suitor. The matter came to blows at the end of June. Very little blood was spilt, but at the end of the confrontation, Mary was in the custody of the Scottish nobility, and Bothwell had fled to Denmark. When Mary was led back into Edinburgh, crowds appeared shouting various insults, and she was imprisoned in a castle in the center of a lake. There she was kept under lock and key while the lords decided how best to be rid of her. But Elizabeth was angry that a female sovereign would be treated like this, and was determined to fight for her cousin's release. She sent an ambassador to Edinburgh to try to resolve matters between Mary and her peers. This time, however, the Scottish lords were determined. By the end of July, with a knife literally at her throat, Mary agreed to abdicate in favor of her son. On July the 29th, he was crowned James VI, King of Scotland. The nobles would now rule through the infant child. Elizabeth continued to rage, but other than taking her anger out on Cecil, there wasn't much she could do. There was no money or appetite for war with Scotland, and that was the only way to get what she wanted. Cecil knew that, and so he simply bore the brunt of her displeasure. By October, the Queen had sufficiently calmed down and realized that she was truly powerless to change the situation in Scotland. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Sussex continued the marital negotiations with the Emperor. It seemed like now the only sticking point was religion. And actually, the Emperor appeared willing to compromise. He now suggested that the Archduke Charles be allowed to attend Mass in private. In public, he would attend Anglican services. Elizabeth's Privy Council was torn over the issue. Cecil was inclined to agree, but ultimately, Dudley won the debate. Elizabeth wrote to Sussex that this compromise was not acceptable, and thus finally died 8 years of marriage negotiations. You might be inclined to criticize Elizabeth for this. But remember, she had witnessed firsthand the problems that Philip's marriage to Queen Mary had brought to the realm. Moreover, the crisis in the Netherlands was now in full swing. All around Europe, the age of religious warfare was erupting. Elizabeth had no intention of having it on her doorstep. Did she need foreign support? Perhaps. But she needed civil war a lot less. By March 1568, relations between Scotland and England were noticeably improved. In fact, Elizabeth outbid Catherine de' Medici for Mary Stuart's old crown jewels, so apparently she was not that upset anymore that her cousin was incarcerated. But then on May the 2nd, Mary escaped from custody. She made it to Hamilton Palace, where she was joined by several lords who assembled an army of 6,000 men. However, Elizabeth had barely received word of this when Mary and her army was crushed at Langside on May 13th. Mary, realizing all was lost, fled the battlefield and made for England, hoping to place herself under Elizabeth's protection. But English authorities south of the border weren't really sure how to receive her. Her arrival posed a dilemma for the government that it would have to deal with for roughly the next 2 decades. Queen Elizabeth insisted that Mary must be restored at once. Cecil argued that it was a mistake to assist a queen who had schemed and plotted against her for years, and was, in every real sense, her enemy and no political innocent whatsoever. Mary should be sent back to Scotland immediately. Elizabeth protested that if she did so, she was sending her cousin to her death, and that was unthinkable. It was difficult to determine what should be done with Mary, since every option carried its own dangers. The last thing Elizabeth wanted was to go to war with Scotland on Mary's behalf, and she felt it would be infinitely preferable if she could bring about a reconciliation between Mary and the Scottish lords on terms that were favorable to England. It would be an absolute disaster to send Mary abroad, say to France or Spain. But even if Elizabeth left her at her liberty in England, she would be an inspiration to every Catholic malcontent in the kingdom. The Queen was aware that there were those of the old faith, both at home and abroad, who regarded Mary as having a better title to the English throne than herself, especially in the Catholic North, where Mary had been cultivating support for years, and where there was spontaneous rejoicing at her coming to England. Those who had met her were impressed by her beauty and charm, and also by her powers of persuasion. It didn't require a great leap of imagination to see her becoming a force for rebellion or treason, and of course, there was always the possibility that King Philip might divert that huge army that he had in the Netherlands, putting down that rebellion, send it over to England to support Mary Stuart's claim. In the end, Elizabeth decided that Mary should remain not in prison, but in honorable custody, as her quote-unquote guest, and under constant observation. The next question was, should Elizabeth meet with Mary? She wanted to, but all of her advisors, including Dudley, said that was a terrible idea. Mary was a Catholic sovereign who had never renounced her claim to the throne of England. Elizabeth simply could not meet with her as an equal. In the end, the Queen relented. Because in the end, what they decided to do was form a sort of impromptu tribunal that would determine if Mary was, in any way, complicit in Darnley's murder. If she was acquitted, then it was agreed Elizabeth would meet with her. In July, Mary was taken to Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, which was to be her lodging for the foreseeable future. It was sufficiently far from both Scotland and London to pose any great security risk. At Bolton, she kept state like a queen and was allowed to indulge her passion for hunting, but she was constantly guarded. Sir Francis Knollys was her host, but had a difficult time coping with her tears and tantrums as she chafed against the restrictions upon her liberty. There was by now a strong, what we would call, Queen's Party in Scotland, and 2 members of it, Lord Herries and the Bishop of Ross, took it upon themselves to go to England and plead Mary's case. Elizabeth told Harries, quote, "If Queen Mary will remit her case to be heard by me as her dear cousin and friend, I will send for her rebels and know their answer why they deposed their queen. If they can allege some reason for doing so, which I think they cannot, then I will restore Mary to her throne, on condition that she renounces her claim to England and abandons her league with France and the Mass in Scotland." End quote. These were tough terms, but the promise was implicit and Mary was desperate. On the 28th of July, she agreed to submit her case to English courts. What she did not know was that all the parties were determined that she wouldn't get to speak in her own defense. Nor did she know that simultaneously Elizabeth had already informed the Scottish lords that she had no intention of restoring Mary to her throne. Now Mary, for her part, was no innocent in this. Almost from the moment she arrived in England, she started to plot against Elizabeth. She wrote to Philip II of Spain that if she had the right support, England could be Catholic again. Still, the last thing Elizabeth wanted was to have Mary found guilty of murder. She realized Mary needed to accept her change in situation, though. Mary had a couple of options here. She could potentially accept her deposition and live as a private person, or maybe rule with the Scottish lords in tandem until James reached the age of majority. But her days of ruling alone were over. That exigency was simply out of the question. Given the strength of English opinion against Mary, Elizabeth could not allow her to be declared innocent. Yet, neither did she want a queen to be subject to the judgment of a tribunal. And so it was, in January 1569, the commissioners assembled delivered the only verdict possible: that nothing had been proven against Mary. Now, Mary, for herself, refused to simply acknowledge that they had any jurisdiction over her at all. But Elizabeth still didn't want to set Mary free. In fact, she dare not. She posed too great a threat, even as a prisoner, for already there were signs that Catholics in England were beginning to regard her as their figurehead. As for Mary, she seemed more interested now in claiming the English throne than in recovering the Scottish one. Prophetically, Cecil would later warn Elizabeth, "The Queen of Scots is, and always shall be, a dangerous person to your estate." Next week, we're going to stay in England and continue with our story to see how Mary, Queen of Scots, proves herself to be, in fact, a dangerous person. In the meantime, if you're looking for some more content, you can click the link in the show notes and you can get a free 7-day trial of Western Civ 2.0. We are past the Punic Wars now and back into that era of chaos between the end of the 2nd century BCE and the rise of Julius Caesar.